President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump have been meeting each other at the Mar-a-Lago retreat in Florida. What would both parties bring to the table concerning issues such as DPRK or trade and other issues? What would they take away from it? Let's continue our discussion with a special roundtable edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, here on CGTN. My guests today include Tim Stratford, Managing Partner of the Covington Burling Beijing Office and former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative; Victor Gao, former interpreter of the late leader Deng Xiaoping, who is also a global councilor with the Asia Society; and Einar Tangen, last but not least, a current affairs commentator. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show.
Thank you.
Indeed, a very interesting time we're witnessing. And if you look at the timing of this meeting, between an incoming U.S. president and a Chinese leader since the time of President Carter, this is about as early as the meeting can be. What do you look at the timing of this meeting? Is it kind of rushed?
I think having the meeting early is good as long as people go in with the right expectations. It's far too soon, especially on the U.S. side, to have to the challenges that we face. We don't even have a lot of the key people in the new Trump administration yet. But so long as it gives the two sides a chance to get to know one another, I think that President Trump and President Xi both want to sort of get a sense of who the other person is. And if they can establish a kind of a framework or lay the groundwork for how they're going to deal with some of the issues going forward, then it might be a good idea to get this in their minds as they're starting to think through the issues more deeply.
I would say this summit meeting is a landmark event in China-U.S. relations, and the precondition for this summit meeting to take place is actually for President Donald Trump and the U.S. government to reaffirm the One China. That One China policy has been reaffirmed. I think from the Chinese side at least there is no fundamental obstacle to prevent the summit meeting from happening. And on that condition, I would say the sooner the meeting takes place, the better, because it allows the two leaders to really look at each other, to exchange views, to understand each other better, and also to be in a position to promote more constructive relations between the two countries. We should control our expectation, and nobody should indulge in too much hope that this summit meeting will solve all the problems existing between China and the United States.
However, we can't help but having a lot of curiosity, at least, on what's going to happen during this meeting. And one of the things that's particularly interesting is that this is an informal meeting at the so-called winter retreat, or that's definitely not in Washington, where everything is kind of scripted. And also, we have seen a series of informal diplomacy between Chinese President Xi Jinping and former U.S. President Barack Obama. What do you think of this new style of diplomacy of the Chinese leadership? Do you think this is going to be effective with President Trump?
Well, you know, quite frankly, I'm of two minds. One, sure, it's fine because, as Victor pointed out, the expectations are very low. I mean, they're trying to control the optics. There's not going to be a press conference, all of these types of things. So it's very low. But on the other hand, it would have been better, given the main point here for China is to have a formal authorization, reaffirmation of the One China policy, to do that in D.C. You know, wearing short sleeves and shirts and lounging around the pool, it just doesn't give that same kind of formality. But I think psychologically, for Donald Trump, this is very important. Here is a guy who wants, he wants to show that he's in a place where he's comfortable. He's surrounded by the rich and powerful. I think this is very, very important to his psyche, and part of why he wants it in Mar-a-Lago.
Have you ever been in a formal meeting between our two governments? They can be so highly scripted that you don't come away feeling that you really understand what the other side is thinking. And I think at this stage, when they're just getting to know each other, being able to be away from the scripted scenario and being able to just to talk and react to one another, I think it will be much more enlightening than having a scripted show. So I'm delighted that they can do this. You know, we'll have to see how it goes, because you don't have the same guardrails you have when you're following a script.
One is all about tweets, and I call it order and chaos, and that type of thing. So I see that there could be a lot of room for some missteps, because these are not people. You know, one says America first, the other one says win-win. Let's do all this together.
Well, for the choice of the location for this summit, I think we can leave it to history as to whether it is the best choice for President Donald Trump. Definitely, it's a very good choice. Whether it is the same good choice for China, we do not need to come to a conclusion right now. But for previous Chinese leaders, they actually insisted that a visit to the United States should be a state visit with all the bells and whistles of a state visit.
Yeah, what kind of changes are we witnessing the Chinese leadership in conducting diplomacy?
Yeah, therefore, I think the fact that this summit meeting is taking place indicates that China now has a very new and unconventional leader. You know, he's very confident of himself. He's eager to try new ways of doing diplomacy, and he doesn't have a lot of concern of traveling long distance, not going to Washington, D.C. and the White House, but going to Mar-a-Lago, the informal and the family residence or club of President Donald Trump. This indicates, I think, the wisdom and courage and the vision of the new Chinese leader, President Xi Jinping. But I hope everything will work out eventually.
So I think right now what they need to focus on is what sort of mechanisms can they be putting in place, what sort of framework for carrying on a dialogue going forward. And, you know, as the last administration was ending, there was a lot of discussion in Washington about, you know, the strategic and economic dialogue and the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade and all the other interactions, and whether they were really accomplishing the job. And I used to be in all of those dialogues, and there are some things that are very good about them. But again, if things are very stilted, and if you have, you know, 200 people in the room, you can't really sit down and have a serious conversation and explore new ways to solve problems.
According to a senior U.S. administration official, and during a briefing that was given out right before this meeting, they said that they want to streamline these kind of dialogue mechanism and make it more result-oriented with a deadline. Yeah, Victor, you wanted to say something, please.
If you allow me to think aloud, I would say as far as President Donald Trump is concerned, this summit meeting is a success for President Trump even before it takes place. Why? Because he at least delivers the summit meeting between China and the United States, and he does have the Chinese president traveling long distance and going into his own familiar environment at the Mar-a-Lago club. This is truly very, very unconventional as far as Chinese diplomacy is concerned. President Xi Jinping is taking an extraordinary step of agreeing to go to Mar-a-Lago and engage in more or less informal and private discussions, which I think is a good method. The two countries need to deal away with all the other hindrances and really allow the two leaders to exchange their minds in a very honest and straightforward manner. And this is our expectation, that this summit meeting will have some legacy for future generations to be proud of.
I think the general U.S. population wants to have good relations with China, and they're looking for things that they can point to give them some optimism about that. And I think that the Xi's being there, President Xi and his wife, I think they can help to put a human face on China, and I think that's a very positive opportunity.
Thank you very much, Tim. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin, here on CGTN. We'll take a break. We'll be back right after this. Now, to address the huge trade deficit between China and the United States, Trump proposed a solution of imposing putative tariffs on China. However, since he came into office, he has kind of refrained from really putting that stance into action. Some people are saying he's not even expected to raise that issue during his meeting with President Xi this time. What do you think are the reasons behind it? Is he realizing that this is not going to work, or is he adopting a wait-and-see tactic, or has he been surrounded by the right people telling him, hold on, this is going to trigger a trade war that's going to hurt the U.S. more than China?
I don't think any of us really expected that he would try to impose that tariff. I think that he was trying to get the attention of people and say this is an important issue, it has to be dealt with some way or another. And I think that at this summit, the economic issues are so complicated that I don't think that the two sides are really prepared to go into depth and to find solutions. So I think what they're trying to do is set the stage. I think that going forward, I don't think we'll see across-the-board tariff imposed on Chinese products at any time during the Trump administration, but I do think that there may be a more aggressive use of trade remedies, anti-dumping, countervailing duty cases, which for specific products may result in the imposition of heavy duties.
Yeah, they've already started doing that. Victor, you wanted to say something?
Since the United States and China are the two largest economies in the world, the United States is larger than China by official exchange rate. China is larger than the United States by purchasing power parity. For these two countries to have the largest bilateral trade volume is something to be proud of. That's the first point I want to make. Yes, indeed, in the $600 billion US trade, China has a huge trade surplus, and the United States has a huge trade deficit, and this problem needs to be fixed sooner the better. However, I would say it is wrong to simply say, because I have a trade surplus, I need to get at your throat and levy punitive damages against you and try to correct the trade imbalance. I think there is a better way. That is, for example, China and the United States should commit to further increasing the bilateral trade from 600 billion to, let's say, 1 trillion. And in the additional 400 billion to be added to China-US trade, the United States should think of all the best ways and means to sell more goods and to China. And I'm sure on the Chinese side, there will be a lot of eagerness to buy more goods from the United States. So looking at China-US trade as a zero-sum game may not be the right way. We need to look at China-US trade in a more dynamic and more constructive way going forward.
But Victor, truthfully, I mean, what the Chinese want is technology, and truthfully, the U.S. is not prepared to do that. But I want to get to a slightly different issue. This issue of that somehow, that Trump has said repeatedly, that China somehow stole jobs from the United States. Well, I mean, this is belied by the facts. We were talking about this earlier. The U.S. actually exports twice as much as it did in 1984. Just pure numbers, all right, with 1/3 less people than it did in 1984. This is due to a couple of things. One, wages in the U.S., which are higher than in China or in many other places in the world. Two, technology. What has been replaced has been robots, automation, all of these things, making things. And what's pushing that? Competition. If you have a higher wage rates, you cannot possibly stay competitive with other places unless you implement automation. So what is driving this is really, the reality is, these three factors. So I'm often a little bit discombobulated that there's continually this idea that somehow jobs are stolen.
Yeah, China has said that this trade or investment issue is something that China can negotiate. What could possibly Chinese President Xi offer to the U.S. administration during this 24-hour span in a framework kind of style, without going into details, to give Donald Trump so that he can satisfy his constituencies who have been crying for jobs?
Yeah, let me use one example. The United States, also including under Donald Trump as the president, are promoting energy independence a lot. And President Donald Trump is pulling off all the plugs from, exploring and producing energy, all kinds of energy, including crude oil and natural gas. Now, China depends on imported crude oil up to about 64% already, and depends on imported natural gas up to about 1/3 of its total consumption. And going forward, I will not be surprised if China need to buy more crude oil, more natural gas in the form of LNG, for example. And if we really suppose that the United States will be very successful in achieving energy independence by producing more coal, more crude oil and more natural gas, China may become the most logical and the largest importer of U.S.-produced crude oil and natural gas. Therefore, I would recommend that President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump really talk about it, because this will be one of the few things which may actually contribute to eventual balancing of trade imbalance in China-U.S. trade. And eventually, if China invests more in the energy sector in the United States and also buy more crude oil and natural gas in the form of LNG, both China and the United States will benefit. And we may actually see China-US trade rising up all the way to 1 trillion.
With a better balance.
The balance will be much better than it is now.
One thing that the United States has really complained about is a so-called systematic barrier in both trade and investment of U.S. companies here in China. Tim, is that an accusation that's well-founded according to your experience?
I would say that it is. I think Victor is right that the best way to deal with the trade deficit is not to sort of block Chinese imports into the U.S., but to figure out how to create more jobs and have more U.S. exports. On the Chinese side, if you look at the industrial policies that have been set up in a lot of the strategic emerging industries, Made in China 2025 identifies 10 industries where China wants to be a global leader. There are a lot of initiatives to substitute imported products for products that are made in China. And to the extent that you carry out policies that do that, then you cut off opportunities for exports for the United States, and instead you incentivize companies to invest in China and build them here. And so that can have an impact on American employment, and so that's one of the areas that we can talk about. I think China, another thing that Xi Jinping could do is be supportive of more Chinese investment in the U.S. of the type that will create high-paying jobs in the U.S. And I think that's something that could be warmly received by President Trump as well.
Yeah, except if it includes Westinghouse, which Chinese would be interested in acquiring, and he has said absolutely not.
However, for Chinese companies to go and invest in the United States, there are also very complicated procedures, and often, for instance, the CFIUS process, which have unfairly, let's say, targeted Chinese companies using national security concerns. Is that an issue here?
We've seen a lot of success with Chinese companies making some very significant acquisitions in the United States. And what you need to do is you just need to get good advice at the beginning. Is this the sort of project that would have a problem? You can get that advice at the beginning, and then you know whether to spend a lot of time pursuing it or not. Yeah. But I don't think CFIUS is really as large of a concern as some people are afraid. They're afraid of the unknown, but I don't think it has to be that way.
Yeah, but if you're in essence saying, you said two things. One, you have to get good advice prior to going into an industry, which means that there are certain industries that are off the table. Right? And second, this idea, I mean, what you said is that what China is doing is exactly what Donald Trump is proposing. He's saying, I want to keep all the jobs here. Don't buy anything from anywhere else. If you go abroad, I'm going to tax you. If you're going abroad, I'm not going to tax you. If it's coming in, I'm going to tax you.
So he can use that as the beginning of a negotiation. But obviously, if you're going to try to reach...
He's been very literal in fulfilling almost all of his campaign promises.
No, we've just been talking about the fact that he hasn't been. He hasn't imposed this tariff. And I think as far as trade, there's virtually nothing that he has done yet to implement any of his trade policy. I think you've
agreed he doesn't have a trade policy yet.
Well, I think that he has some objectives, but I think there's a lot of unfolding to do. Remember, he doesn't even have his U.S. trade representative confirmed yet.
I would say when we look at China-US trade, we should be broader in our scope. We should look at other possibilities. Let me use one example. China is promoting the One Belt, One Road initiative. More than 70 to 80 countries are now part of that. Why shouldn't the United States also join that big initiative? Companies like Caterpillar would be very happy to really get more business along that initiative. And also,
do you think this is going to come up during the meeting this time, this One Belt, One Road?
And I hope so. And also, for example, if we look at other countries, especially countries in the Middle East and Africa, where they have tremendous amount of high-quality solar resources, why shouldn't China and the United States and some of the European countries really team up together to come up with a total solution to enable these countries to use more solar power for themselves and also for export and save crude oil for other countries? And I think once we become more open-minded in exploring how China and the United States, based on more mutual trust, can help each other and help the rest of the world, we have a better business paradigm.
Let's see whether the leaders have the imagination and the wisdom. Yeah.
America first. This is what I'm asking you. What you're saying, I think, expresses China's view, but I don't know.
I think if I can have a chance to have a word with President Donald Trump, I would say making America first is not a problem. I would say all the countries in the world want to make themselves the first, but the downside is that you cannot expect to make yourself first and make other countries last and the least. So there should be a take and give, and eventually you need to more balanced, because otherwise you alienate yourself in front of the totality of the rest.
Trump is talking about balance and reciprocity, and that's a realistic way to sort of look after your own interests. What he can say is, we have erred too far on the other side, and now we need to have more balance and reciprocity. But you have to have that, or else nobody's going to want to deal with you.
He's the first president to throw security onto the trade table and start talking about how he's going to use both of these to get the better deal. This is a real departure.
Yes, talking about security, we're going to talk about that right after this short break. Stay with us. The issue of DPRK is one of the most urgent issues facing the U.S. administration, according to a senior U.S. administration official. Now, Trump, during an interview with the Financial Times, has said if China does not help the United States solve the problem concerning the DPRK, the U.S. is going to do it alone. What do you think are the options for the United States? Do you think that the U.S. can solve the problem by going it alone?
No. I don't think so. I mean, three options. You engage. Remember before, he says, I'm going to have a hamburger with Kim and we're going to sort this all out. Second, you double down on what they're currently doing, which is the economic sanctions and things like that. But there's not much room left in that toolbox, I don't think. And the third is to contemplate some sort of military, either lethal or non-lethal things. I don't think that any of those three make sense. I think there have been, Mattis has said, look, this is going to take a joint effort.
Why is he saying that then? Why is he saying that the U.S. is going to do it alone?
I would say that, first of all, the nuclear program as well as the launch vehicle program by DPRK are bad developments on the Korean Peninsula. It's bad for the United States, it's bad for China. Secondly, China has done its best to try to boycott and try to impose sanctions on DPRK, and China is working very closely with the United States. Therefore, I think President Donald Trump should be a little bit more accurate in describing the situation. It's not that China is supporting the nuclear program of DPRK. China is completely happy and committed to work very closely with the United States to achieve the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, the second point I want to emphasize is that it is easy for a big power, especially the only surviving superpower in the world, the United States, to take unilateral military action. That's not the challenge. The challenge is, once you take unilateral military action, whether the situation you create will be better than the situation before, or you may end up with a greater mess, with greater destruction, with greater losses to your own people and to the reputation of your country. Therefore, I don't think taking unilateral action as far as the Korean Peninsula is concerned is a right option, because it may actually make the whole situation much worse than it is now. It is time for more dialogue, for peaceful negotiation and sanctions again against DPRK.
China has been saying that China wants to see a mutual suspension, meaning the DPRK suspending its nuclear activity, suspending testing any missiles, and at the same time the ROK and the United States suspend their joint military drills, which are right at the doorstep of the DPRK. However, we haven't heard any positive response to this proposal.
Well, I think the U.S. has rejected that out of hand, and I think the view in the U.S. is we have tried everything that we can think of. We've had several rounds over the last couple of decades of dialogue, and we don't have any confidence at all that the current regime in North Korea is prepared to do anything but take advantage of any lulls in order to further its nuclear program. So the U.S. government's feeling is we've already tried all these other things. They simply have not worked. We are in a position than we were 10 years ago, than we were 20 years ago.
But by continuing the military drill is not going to make the situation better, is it?
Well, there's nothing else that has happened that has made the situation better.
I have 2 points. One, Victor, I don't think that the U.S. would agree that China has worked closely. Only recently did they take away the coal imports. So there's always been a question, and it continues to be a question of just how far. Second, this issue of pushing North Korea to the brink of a regime change, which seems to be the effort, is crazy. I mean, we've already seen what has happened in vacuums around the world when you go in and you try to push this. The last thing I think anybody wants is some sort of civil war or warlordism going on in a country that has already nascent nuclear capabilities. So I don't understand how it can be a solution to try to shove them down the road.
I think it is the common interest, the common wish of both the United States and China to see a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. The thing is, how do you approach that goal? Do you think the two countries can find common ground or compromise in solving this?
Yeah, you just now mentioned the two-pronged approach proposed by China through the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. I would say that this two-pronged approach proposal is a noble proposal. It's out of dignity and decency. But whether this proposal is acceptable either to DPRK or to the United States of America or to South Korea is highly questionable. So whether the proposal, as elegant as it is really pragmatic and practical and feasible, that's another question. Therefore, I think between China and the United States in particular, they need to exercise greater wisdom and courage and vision to come up with a plan together. The more China and the United States can work together and see this big issue eye to eye, the better it will be to eventually come up with a more constructive solution of the DPRK nuclear program and the tension on the Korean peninsula.
So to agree to disagree, like what we have been doing?
It's like a slow motion train wreck. The issues specifically on the table is that THAAD is out there. I mean, it's pushing the envelope even further towards tension. Second, the issue is the U.S. has said categorically there will be no talks until they abandon nuclear things. This is the only leverage that they have. What is North Korea ultimately looking for? They want security assurances that their regime will remain in place and there will be no attacks. So everything is on the table. It's fine to say, let us get greater wisdom and things like that, but the fact is, no one is addressing what is on the table and being realistic.
Well, China has proposed this dual-track negotiation, right? On the one hand, you try to find a nuclear-free peninsula through the six-party talks, and then on the other hand, you try to have the problem ultimately solved, to have a peace mechanism on the Korean peninsula. But I think this is really a very complicated issue. It's definitely too big for a 24-hour meeting between the two leaders. But finally, in one sentence, what would you consider this meeting a success if you see what?
Good optics.
Good optics.
And also the two sides agree to disagree on certain issues and agree to make joint efforts to narrow the differences and make good on all the agreed points. Make China and the United States great together.
I think your first point that they agree that there's one China would be huge.
I don't think there's a disagreement about that. I think that what I'm looking for is to see mechanisms coming out of this meeting where there are going to be specific channels that are going to be working very energetically to solve some of these problems that have been intractable till now. So I think you designate leaders on each side that are going to take charge of certain things, and the two presidents say, okay, we want you to come back to us with a report within a certain period about how we're going to solve this together.
Thank you very much, Tim Stratford, Victor Gao, and Einar Tangen for joining us. And that has been our roundtable discussion on the meeting between President Xi and President Trump. My last point is coming right up. Stay with me. The speed with which this meeting has been set up is already cause for hope. Where you meet somebody, barriers are by their very nature broken down. Body language, eye contacts can go a long way in enhancing understanding. As leaders of the two biggest economies in the world, personal chemistry should count a lot. Let us hope that this is just the first of many such meetings to come that will really deliver for everyone, be it called win-win or reciprocity. That's it for this special roundtable edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, here on CGTN. Download the CGTN live application to watch the show live on your mobile devices, or follow me on Facebook, Twitter by the handle The Point with LX. You can also watch our previous shows on the CGTN page on YouTube. Click on playlist and look for The Point with Liu Xin. Thank you for watching. See you next time on CGTN.